It's tiny, right there between Judges and Samuel. Flip too fast, you'll miss it. So, I had actually never seen anything like this before. Big box stores like Walmart and Home Depot just lying flat. No street signs, no street lights, no traffic signals. Door to door, it looked like somebody had come along and pulled out the final Jenga block of each house, causing one after the other to fall like a pile of sticks. A trailer park, just gone, without even a sign that there had ever been a trailer there before. A hospital, picked up and moved off of its foundation. Jane and I had just moved to Kansas City, Missouri in 2011, when the deadliest tornado to hit the United States since 1947 hit the city of Joplin 2.5 hours south of us. And the tornado plowed through Joplin on a Sunday night. And on Wednesday, I was walking through Joplin with a group of pastors and ministry leaders, construction workers, and volunteers as part of this huge emergency response team. We worked all day, from the moment the sun came up to the moment it went down. And it was the kind of work that felt utterly pointless and meaningless. Like, at this one house that we worked on, for 4 or 5 hours, we spent the entire time dragging everything that was sitting on the foundation off of the foundation and then hauling it down to the street so that removal teams would come and haul it away days later. We spent 4 or 5 hours basically pushing a pile of garbage about 20 feet. And then there were some of the stories that were just heartbreaking. Like this woman who was sitting on the front steps of her house, of what used to be a house. And as we were walking down the street, we saw her just kind of staring off into space, and a couple of us walked up to her, and we realized she was just in this state of shock. And so we asked if she needed anything. No. We asked if she had a place to stay. No. We asked if this had been her home, and she said for a week. And we were kind of surprised, and we kind of looked at each other and said, "Where did you move from?" And she said, "Well, my home burned down a couple weeks ago in a fire, and so I moved here last week." What do you do in a place that is just littered with destruction debris? What do you do when human lives are just numb, devastated by the loss of homes, some the loss of loved ones? When we spent only a day there, and the enormity of the situation, it just felt impossibly heavy. And you thought, how in the world will life ever be restored for these people? We put a team of students together and went back 4 or 5 weeks later, and we actually saw pretty much the same thing. There was less debris, but the landscape was just as bleak. Home Depot was rebuilding, so was Walmart, and there was a random house here or there where they had begun to reframe, and so there was some construction happening. But mostly the city was still just trying to get rid of ridiculous amounts of debris. They were trying to deal with just basic safety issues, meet people's basic needs, like how do people eat warm food, and start where possible to put some things back together. My experiences in Joplin have, for me, become this powerful image of the way that God restores. It happens over time. He uses people, and even the very worst devastation is not beyond God's ability to create and to restore. The reason I bring up Joplin is I want us to be thinking about the kinds of situations that seem irreversible, that seem utterly irredeemable. Because this is exactly where the book of Ruth shows up in Scripture, right? The book of Ruth comes to our rescue after Judges leaves us depleted and longing desperately for a taste of redemption. But when you finish Judges, there's a sense in which the thought of redemption still feels out of reach, feels impossible. These people are terrible. Right? These people are too far gone. There's no hope for these people. I mean, think about some of the things that we witnessed in the book of Judges. They have God's holy priests running around selling their priestly services to the highest and most prestigious bidder. They go to war against each other over a false or at best incomplete story of injustice. They almost wipe out an entire tribe among them. And to save that tribe, the best solution they can come up with is stealing and essentially enslaving 600 women, forcing them into marriages against their will. I mean, this is bleak stuff. And as I pointed out last week, when Ruth gets started, we're hoping for a sign that things are going to be different. And yet it doesn't quite start out that way, because as we start reading in chapter 1, verse 19, we hear, chapter 1, verse 19, so the two, Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." And the name Mara, the word Mara means bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. So Naomi had been forced to leave Bethlehem because of a famine. But she and her husband and her two sons had made a home for themselves in Moab. But over a period of 10 years, bit by bit, Naomi lost everything. Her husband and her two sons, so that with nothing left in Moab and with word that the famine in her hometown had ended, she decided to return. But as she returned, she went back as a widow without a thing in the world. Her family's land was out of reach for her. The possibility of rebuilding a family was out of the question. She was too old. The only thing that Naomi had was Ruth, her daughter-in-law. To Naomi, her life demanded a more appropriate name. And so she asked to be called bitter, for bitterness is what had come to define her life. I think it's important that the book of Ruth starts here for us, because it is in Naomi's experience that we can really accept that these events take place during the time of the Judges, right? Because we expect the lives of people during this time to be filled with pain and bitterness. And so Ruth makes some sense for us. But it's then in the end of the story that we need to pay attention. The end of the story is where it's important for us to really hear what's happening. And so chapter 4, verse 13. We read, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him.' Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, 'A son has been born to Naomi.' They called him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." Last week, I filled in most of the middle of this story. We looked at the lives of both Ruth and Boaz, and we saw two people who were living against the grain of their culture, living against the spirit of the age. While everyone else was doing what was right in their own eyes, Ruth, the vulnerable outsider, and Boaz, the powerful insider, both did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now, what's interesting about what they do is that neither of them was rigidly following a law. In fact, you never hear either of them begrudgingly appeal to the law as the reason that they do what they do, right? You don't hear Boaz say, I guess I'll make sure that I protect Ruth in my fields because I think she's related to somebody I know. I guess I will try to love my mother-in-law. Right? We don't hear Ruth say that either. In fact, both Ruth and Boaz, they did more than what was required of them by the law. Both of them went above and beyond. They exceeded what was expected of them. In this, Boaz and Ruth, they demonstrate a real and abiding compassion, something that is in them, and also incredible courage. They demonstrated incredible faithfulness to God as their king. They were eager to serve their king whom they loved. That was the focus of last week's sermon. But this week we're looking at something a little bit different. Last week we looked at Ruth and Boaz's faithfulness. This week we're looking at the fruit of faithfulness. What does faithfulness produce? What does faithfulness do or accomplish in the midst of devastation? What can the faithfulness of God's people bring to hopeless and bitter circumstances? This is the bigger story that Ruth is interested in telling. This is the story that frames Ruth. Life is not merely about doing what you should do, right? Like, oh, here's Boaz. Hey, everybody try to be like Boaz and do the things that Boaz does. Or, hey, all of you, look at Ruth and be like Ruth. Life is about so much more than merely imitating somebody else. And the end of Ruth begins to draw us into that more. Naomi starts out the story surrounded by death. And now she is engulfed in new life. Naomi asked everyone to call her bitter because she was convinced the Lord had brought this tragedy on her. But by the end of the story, nobody calls her bitter. The Lord is being blessed by everyone because of what Ruth and Boaz had done for her. Naomi said that the Lord had brought her back empty. But by the end, it says that Naomi has been restored to life. One commentator suggests that what this means most literally is that having been emptied, she has now been brought back to fullness or wholeness. Naomi was marked by despair, but now, not only Naomi, but the women in Naomi's community have great hope for the future. Ruth is about reversal. It is about restoration. When I returned to Joplin 4 or 5 weeks after the tornado, I was shocked by the hopefulness I found everywhere. The numbness and the shock that I saw on my first trip had been transformed. Joplin had been flooded by volunteers. Church groups poured into the city. Men and women driven by compassion and courage made Joplin their home. And they partnered with that city, meeting people in their loss and filling them with the hope of restoration. It was incredible. 4 or 5 weeks later, the city didn't look much different at all, but the spirit of the city had changed. 4 years later now, the city looks very different. And it'd be worth comparing Joplin to other places where disaster struck and people weren't so eager. to respond with the same kind of compassion and courage. Restoration takes time. And without the hope of restoration, it can be incredibly difficult to see past piles of debris, right? To see a future beyond the rubbish that surrounds you. And whether that's literal debris from life's disasters or metaphorical debris, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual stuff in our lives that keep us from seeing beyond. The courage and the compassion of Ruth and Boaz give Naomi a reason to hope for restoration. So that in the middle of the story, right in the middle of these 4 chapters, we actually find that Naomi begins to join with them. She becomes an active member of Team Restoration, right? It starts with Ruth. Ruth, when she comes alongside Naomi, she gives Naomi a reason to hope because she communicates to her that no matter what happens, Naomi would never be alone. Even if death is what the two of them are going to face together, at least they'll face it together. Ruth vows to be with her even in death. And then it's Boaz coming alongside both Ruth and Naomi. Naomi is then able to trust that she will eat her daily bread, which isn't a given for a widow in this world. And it's important to say this. When Jesus teaches us to pray, give us today our daily bread, he is teaching us a prayer that has a different meaning based on how much we have. If you're a foreigner and you're traveling through Israel, if you were a widow or an orphan, God had already made clear where your daily bread was to come from. Your daily bread always comes from the generosity of God. God has given more than enough, but it would come in and through the lives of God's people as faithful conduits of that generosity. For Israel, the time of the judges, Israel still in their sins, slaves to greed, they needed a law. They needed a law to command their generosity. Israel needed to be told how to practice generosity, just how generous to be, because they weren't going to do it on their own. These were people who had no impulse to be generous unless God said, be generous or else. For Israel, set free from their sins, filled with God's Holy Spirit, this kind of generosity becomes their second nature. The book of Acts introduces us to these people who are no longer slaves to greed. They were the kind of people who, having more than their daily bread, prayed that God would provide daily bread for his people, and then they realized, oh, we have that daily bread for them. And so they gave extra so that there was no one in need among them. The passages in Acts that describe the people as this generous are entirely Jewish at this point. And so we see God's people living out this calling because generosity sort of erupts from within them. If you have more than your daily bread, praying for daily bread is supposed to be a reminder that God wants you to use to provide daily bread for your neighbor who might be without. And if you are a person who isn't quite sure where your daily bread is going to come from, your prayer for daily bread is actually a prayer for God's people. It's a prayer that asks God to work through his people, to make them the kind of generous people that meet today's need. Ruth and Boaz meet the most basic of needs. And so Naomi can be confident in 2 things. The first is that she isn't alone. No matter what happens, she is not alone. And the second thing is that she can trust that she will eat. When these two basic needs are met in Naomi, she can begin to hope. She can do more than pity herself. When there is a friend and there is food for tomorrow, she can begin to see the path forward. She can actually look for the path and she can begin to walk it. But of course, Ruth and Boaz, they do far more than make a poor widow's life better. They do that, but they do so much more. Their faithfulness bears fruit that then feeds an entire community and that nourishes a nation. We saw in the book of Judges how little people paid attention to the Lord during the time of the Judges. We saw how quickly people took credit for the Lord's work. We saw people use the Lord's name to feel good or to bless their own plans. But none of this happens at the end of Ruth. The result of Ruth and Boaz serving faithfully is that the Lord's name is blessed. God's goodness is seen and it's celebrated. And it's not just the three of them having a party together. God is good. Praise goes up throughout Bethlehem. Ruth and Boaz fascinate me for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is their marriage. They get married, and if we're honest, this marriage is weird. The circumstances of it, right? Nothing looks quite like marriages that we see today. Neither Ruth nor Boaz declare their undying love for each other. Neither is looking for another to complete them. Ruth and Boaz marry as a way to bless Naomi. They marry as a way to bless the family of Elimelech, as a way to satisfy justice. This probably seems incredibly unromantic, and that's mostly because it is. They married for purposes other than their own self-satisfaction, their own self-fulfillment. They married because they had God's ways and God's will on their hearts and their minds. The Bible rarely portrays marriage in romantic terms. The book of Ruth, however, makes it clear that Ruth and Boaz have a deep appreciation for each other. They both speak of the kindness of God that they see in each other. They see courage. They see compassion in each other. And so the reality is neither of them is forced into this marriage, but they both walk confidently into it, assured of what God seems to be doing in their midst. But again, their marriage is about far more than them. They choose to be married in order to be a blessing to God's creation. And bless is exactly what they do, right? Blessing Naomi, blessing the women that are around Naomi, blessing the town of Bethlehem, and then even blessing Israel itself through their great-grandson, Israel's mighty king, David, who is the fruit of their faithfulness. Oh, one of the most important questions that you can ask before you get married is, who is better? Whose lives are better? Who is blessed because we are together? Are we a blessing or are we a burden to others? And we all know the difference, right? There are those couples that overflow with compassion and courage, couples who constantly encourage each other to be more generous and selfless. We know those couples whose relationships are marked by God's love, and it just sort of pours out of them into all of the people around them. And we know those couples who drain everyone around them. They're like bulls that just ram into each other constantly. And then, in the only sign that they are united in any way, they then work together to ram everyone around them as well. Romans 12, Jeannie read for us earlier, is a decent guide to answering this question. Jeannie read for us earlier, but we could work our way through this passage and reflect on each of the points. Who is blessed because of us? Who is comforted because of us? Who feels welcomed and accepted? Who believes that they belong in God's family because of us? Who experiences the peace of God because it's present in their lives through us? Who is fed and clothed and nourished because of us? And who experiences God's goodness because of us? And obviously, right, the because of us means because of God at work through us, because we are open to God's work in and through us. But you could work your way through that passage and reflect on that question. And obviously, if you've been married for 2 years or 11 years or 40 years, the same questions need to be asked. Who is better off? Because the two of us are married. And since Paul suggests in 1 Corinthians that marriage can actually be a distraction that keeps us from serving the Lord and our neighbors, these questions are equally relevant, if not more so, for those who remain single. Who is better? Because I am in their life and because God is alive in me. I was thinking about Ruth and Boaz this week and the way that their lives blessed others when an interview came on the radio Thursday morning. And a man started to share about a book that he had written and a presentation he gives based on the book. The book and the presentation, they tell the story of an ordinary Catholic couple. The story was so powerful that I actually bought the book on Thursday and then read it on Friday, just so I could share the story and make sure I had the details correct this morning. The couple, Franz and Mine, clearly are not from here, lived in a small town in the Netherlands before, during, and after World War II. And the story revolves around their decision to hide Jews in their home. Jews who had escaped from Germany or from some of the major Dutch cities like Amsterdam. Welcoming 2 young Jews into their home, they thought that this would be a one-time thing for a few weeks. Those 2 stayed until the war ended, and before they knew what had happened to them, they had 3, and then they had 6, and then they had 8 throughout the war. Franz and Mine continued to hide Jews in their home and find others who would hide Jews in their homes. And even when they heard stories of people being executed by the German secret police, and even when local Christian and political leaders came to them and urged them, begged them, pleaded with them to stop, they continued. Franz and Mine had incredible compassion and courage. One of the most haunting details of their story was the Christian leader who was the leader of their congregation, who would run into Franz in town and say, "Oh no, every time I see you, my life is in danger." Or, "You make nothing but trouble for me." When Franz appeals to Christian compassion, the clergy has a ready theological rationale for why these Jews might be beyond compassion. The reality was the clergy was just expressing what seemed right in the eyes of most people in that day, of most Christians in that day. The Jews were somehow beyond compassion. Jews were despised. And so everyone, Christians included, should despise them as well. Horrifically, Christians came up with spiritual, biblical reasons for hating them. But as most of us have probably experienced at some point, we can be pretty good at using God or the Bible to baptize our prejudices. Nobody helped Jews, and so why should Franz and mine be any different? But that's the thing, right? Franz and mine demonstrated true courage by showing compassion when it was risky and when it put their lives in danger, right? It's easy to show compassion any old time when it doesn't cost you much. They showed true compassion by refusing to accept the bigotry of their day as good or true or right or normal. They showed true courage by calling others to live out their Christian convictions, to do good to their Jewish neighbors, even if they thought that Jews were their enemies. As the author of the book was wrapping up his story, the interviewer shared the name of the book. That was the point I realized I had to buy it. And I was immediately struck by its connection to our story this week. The book is called Two, Among the Righteous Few. I immediately thought of the two, Ruth and Boaz, among a few who were righteous in the midst of everyone doing what seemed right in their own eyes at the time of the judges. The interviewer asked the author why he had given his life to telling this story, and the author began to tell one final story. One of the couples that Franz and mine welcomed into their home became pregnant. And if you've read anything about pregnancy for Jews hiding during World War II, this was one of the most dangerous circumstances you could create, not just for yourself and your family, but for the people hiding you and anybody hiding with you. This was dangerous. But Franz and mine were committed to this young couple. And so mine went through an elaborate process where she pretended to be pregnant for the remainder of this young woman's pregnancy, so that when the baby was born, they went and publicly registered the baby as their own. That way the baby could go to the doctor and could be outside. The author then said that baby was given a life at potentially great cost. That young couple then was given life because of Franz and mine. And more than that, 9 years ago, the author said, I married that baby, who is no longer a baby. The life that Franz and mine risked everything for continues to ripple out even today. As people like us hear their stories of courage and compassion, we say, is this the kind of life that God is calling us to? They were just two among the righteous few. During a time when 6 million Jews lost their lives because far too many people went with the grain. Far too many people did what was easy, what was normal, because far too many people looked out for themselves and their own safety. Franz and mine lived lives of courage and compassion that continued to bear fruit in a new century. It's interesting for us as we hear that story to think about who Jesus was. At the heart of the gospel, essentially, is the story that the death and resurrection of Jesus are a series of acts that bring life, that bring fullness, that come to those who are empty and restores them. And the incredible thing about this is that an event that happened 2,000 years ago continues to bear fruit today. That his faithfulness continues to bless the nations. That we are recipients of the courage and compassion of Jesus, of the faithfulness of Jesus, of the love of Jesus. And it's in his faithfulness that we find life. And so we come to the table this morning to remember his faithfulness. That in the face of death, knowing it would be painful, he walked that journey for us so that we might have life. And if we experience the newness of life found in this life with God, then the call on our lives is to imitate Jesus, seeing that every day, in every encounter, in every instance, we have this incredible privilege of bringing new life into dark, hopeless places, into despair. That we have this incredible opportunity to be a part of seeing God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven.